name is Nick Murray. With my wife Sue, we run Rack Press, and we've run it for 14 years. We published 46 poets, and last week Sue was looking down the list, which we always, of the Rack poets on the inside back cover, and she noticed something neither of us had actually realised, that we have published 23 male and 23 female poets. Imagine if that was the case in the boardrooms, the universities, the parliament. Anyway.
International Women's Day, the day when every year across the world we celebrate women and women's achievements. This year's theme is Balance for Better. What is better than celebrating women's poetry? Speaking Again, the title, is inspired by Ella Wheeler Wilcox's poem, Protest. The few who dare must speak and speak again to right the wrongs of many. Women speaking again. Thank you.
So we're going to begin with Martina Evans, who many of you know is a fantastic poet and a fantastic reader of her poetry. And I almost don't know what to add to that, but it's good. Martina.
Hi everyone, really glad to be here, and it's happy St. David's Day. So I'm going to start with my poem So. The best so was a now so, a triumphant there you are that I tried out when wrapping a pan loaf with the new peach tissue that came in after people realised newsprint wasn't such a good idea on your bread. So sugaring what you so-and-so, said Carol Carey, before complaining me to Mammy for rolling 6 oranges over the black wooden counter with my left hand, while reading from Maupassant with my right. Then there was so as an alternative. For example, I'm sorry, but we're out of Barry's tea. Well, I'll have lines as so. Or I'll have lines as so then. Pale Anne Callahan came in shyly, her arms folded, no preliminary, just a heavy silence before she said, I'll have a sliced pan so. It was like an answer without a question, a back-footed scene so shrouded in ellipsis I couldn't speak, especially when Anne was so shy too. I didn't even get to wrap it. The green and white, red and yellow, wax-papered pan was good to go. So all that was left for me was to say goodbye so to Anne's pink woolen retreating back, while pitching coppers and silver from a distance of 6 inches into each compartment of the wooden cash drawer, hoping they'd land, but they rarely did. Just so. So it's a bit contagious when you start saying so and you can't stop. But that's how we've mangled the English language. It's, yeah. So the next, and speaking of mangling the English language, the person who probably started us off, on the page at least, was James Joyce. And this poem is set in the Mater Hospital in Eccles Street, and just on number 7 Eccles Street is where Leopold Bloom, the hero of Ulysses, lived. Well, fictionally lived. And that's why I've called it Night Town. Up all night in the Mater, pushing an X-ray machine through fluorescent light. I'd waited 8 hours for the last coronary bypass to come back, and when it did, I'd given up and gone back to bed. So I had to come down again in the old cage lift from the doctor's res, to the heart arrested in ITU, the body bucking, the surgeon from Dubai shoving me to one side as I centred the X-ray tube and my cross of light on the sunken sternum. His neat brown fingers cut into my picture, chopping the stitches with the side of his hand. He pulled out the heart and massaged it in front of me, while I heaved in my forbidden open-toe sandals. I'd stopped wearing shoes after my first 24 hours on call at Cork Regional. RTA, get up out of that quick. The porter, who knew all of the Yangtze River menu by heart, shouted there was 2 stretchers coming up from a road traffic accident. I sat on the side of the narrow bed, felt for my shoes. Only my feet were tender watermelons now that refused to go in. Forcing them, I couldn't take one step, like an ugly sister or a stepmother in iron shoes. I hoped bare feet wouldn't be noticed in an emergency. "Oh, and is it a gypsy you are now, so?" the A&E sister snapped out of her blue lead apron as I padded around the immobilised, blood and alcohol smelling bodies with my sandbags and cassettes, marking right and left, concentrating on not mixing them up like I had before. That bossy sister noticed everything I did. I woke next day in the stuffy on-call room at 4:30. My day off already disappeared into November darkness as I hurried to the shoe shop in Wilton Shopping Centre. The assistant told me that feet never stopped growing. Half a size for every year, I'm telling you, girl. Sleepy and bewildered, I bought a big size 7, and it was only when I revived over beans and toast at 8 o'clock that it hit me. By that reasoning, my feet would be size 12 at the age of 30. With yards to go ahead of me. The coffin that would hold me hasn't been built yet. I shouted into the empty beige kitchen. Back in the shop next day for an exchange. No sign of the first assistant. The older beehived woman said she'd never heard of her. And I've written a lot of poems about feet and shoes. The next one is, but I've just seen Lucy pop, and the last time I read that poem about the feet for International Women's Day, I ended up at the Homerton Hospital with glass in my foot and casualty and all the things in the poem. So this is very short. You can't go out like that. It took Leodon a long time to forgive me for saying that her yellow-tongued pumps were like something a prostitute would wear. Later, I bought MBTs for plantar fasciitis, convinced by the testimonials for foot cures as powerful as the touch of a saint's bone. Leanne said they were supposed to give you a tight butt, but I wanted comfort. Wrapped in fake fur, earmuffs, blue cross and chain, I rocked near the hall door on my giant trainers. And Leodon said, "You can't go out like that, Mum. You look like a rapper."
Next, Denise Saul. Denise is that pamphlet, I remember, House of Blue, was Poetry Book Society pamphlet recommendation, and I remember enjoyed doing that one. And she's just about to complete her PhD in creative writing, so we're wishing you well with that. Anyway, Denise.
Evening, everyone. Happy St. David's Day. I'm going to start off reading my prose poems, so they're quite short. The White Room. There's a moment for meditation when the doctor leads me into the room with table, bed and cupboard. When he leaves, I look out of the small window. There's a view of other windows, unknown. I never thought that I would make peace with noise. Chimes of the midnight bell, traffic, and low-flying planes remind me that God is a never-ending white ceiling. I look at the right hand that doesn't move on the cushion, and I name it Paula. The clenched fingers look like a woman's head, and this is where I locate your mouth, in this small fist. My mother had aphasia, which is a speech disability caused by brain trauma to the speech centres of the brain. And this reflects our relationship. Someone walked into a garden. He's the same one who gave us the word and took it away when we sat in the garden where bindweeds climbed the wall. And this is where we heard him count 7 days into a week. We saw someone who looked like you, and when she turned around, it was me talking to myself. And I had dreamt this before, someone who walked into the garden. I know it's you when I talk with the God of Roses. I have dreamt this often. It's quite interesting for International Women's Day that the majority of carers are women. The youngest daughter as a carer. The mirror flips her left to right, but doesn't turn her upside down. Out of focus objects are interpreted by the mind as deep background. My mother looks at another reflection. Experience shows her that her head only turns to the right. An instance may be seen when two mirrors face each other. The first will be reflected in the second. I nod, and my mother also nods. There are many occasions when I do not see myself. This poem is dedicated to the occupational therapist who saw a person as a person and not as an object. Therapy. The occupational therapist touched my mother's head. Lovely headscarf. What a lovely blue. My mother looked into her face and touched her arm. The occupational therapist said the colour was lovely and the way that the bow rested on her neck was lovely. She said women in Australia tie their headscarves not like that, not like a flower, not like a rose, to be precise. She asked my mother about her legs. Did they feel cold or too warm, as it was hot outside but cool in the room? She said all this when she tucked the blanket over mother's lap. My mother looked further into her eyes. The blue bow slipped further down the side of her face, and she gently tried to push it away. Lovely blue, said my mother. The conversations my mother and I had were centred not only with words but using parts of the body. What a mother says to an index finger. Mother and I chat about dinner. I cannot work out what she wants in the kitchen when I stare at her finger. Perhaps she will point again if I look straight ahead. I think there's a reason to say nothing. As a carer, I spent a lot of time in different rooms of the house, but I also love to connect with nature. Respite. I sometimes went off on short walks to the park where every path looked the same. I wondered whether she would understand why I went to the park. All day working in the same house where I talk to myself. I wondered whether my mother wanted to also go outside and if I should mention my walks to the park. If I think about it, most people's conversations aren't that interesting. And this last poem is a sequence, one of a sequence. They see the hands that cover their bodies. Gatekeepers fly through our garden. I cannot catch them without a net. Again, I close my hands together, but they see the trap. They feel my palms. I cannot catch them when I walk because my body must be still behind the delphiniums. I must become the delphinium if I am to hold them. They see the hands that cover their bodies. These outstretched fingers are too slow. We're not afraid, they say. No one has ever caught us without a net.
Well, it's unusual for me to be out of Wales on St David's Day, and technically I should be wearing a daffodil, but it's quite nice to have a little bunch next to me instead. So I'm going to read all 4 poems from this pamphlet. Stay. Stays with metal eyelids make for tighter lacing to create that hourglass shape, as if sand might run through us, weight our feet until we're turned upside down again. I knew a girl who had her 2 lowest ribs removed to alter her waist, as if her body were a dress. Fainting, displacement of internal organs, and crushed muscles are nothing compared with that steel skeleton, the crinoline. Mine's a cage of latex from the gutter tree, inside which I perch like a bird. Not like the type Elsie was wearing when she leaned too far over the fender to reach for a spoon, or Anne, the edge of whose skirt caught in a machine shaft in the mangle room at Furwood Bleach Works, or Eliza, who leapt off Clifton Suspension Bridge in 1862 and found herself eye to eye with a gannet and 2 sparrowhawks when her crinoline became a parachute, which slowed her descent to such a pace she counted 16 rivets on a stanchion, spotted a tug returning to port, from which the rows of houses radiated out like the petals of a marigold, and that alone made her want to stay. This next poem is called Gwen, and when I started writing it, I wanted it to be in the voice of the painter Gwen John, but the poem had other ideas, and it's actually written in the voice of Jeanne Foster, who sat for Gwen. Gwen. She takes down my hair and does it like her own. Gwen has me sit as she does, and I feel her absorb me as I twist in a wicker chair in her garret in the Rue du Cherche-Midi. It's as if I am the canvas and Gwen is the paint. Yet here we are, one woman on the steps of the Grand Palais at her first exhibition in Paris, where people will sniff the window of each portrait, most of them of me. What have we been doing that it's taken us 17 years to share this square of marble? Shagging Rodin. Yes, Gwen was sitting for Auguste while I was sitting for her. I couldn't tell her. I too gave way like clay beneath his touch. With Auguste I shrank in the firing. With Gwen I expanded in the drying. You have to allow 1 to 3 weeks dry time with oils. I can't get the smell of her linseed oil out of my hair. Her sheen shines off me in every picture here. But there's one missing. It's where a mother and daughter in black walk back across the beach from light into darkness at Tenby, where she grew up. The bay, a palette of blue and yellow villas. Is Gwen retracing her steps back to that day when her mother's heart stopped in an attic when she was 8 and the paint ticked from her horsehair brush like green blood? Roadkill. Pete would bring me a bobtail or 2 on a Saturday. I never thought to ask where the rest of the rabbit was. Slinking through gorse bushes on the racecourse to pace the long straight road out of town, he was killing time, waiting for a quick death, so he could cradle a fox from the tarmac. We thought he was trying to save them, revive them, to put the life back into them, which he was if you count taxidermy a kind of preservation, not an arrangement of skin by which you recreate creatures for recreation. His house was full of stuffed stoats and squinty squirrels. They tiptoe on his windowsills as if waiting to be let out. They were company for an old man going blind, pets you can't wake up. But still, he'd risk the road. The last time I saw him was outside his cottage with his dog, so faithful it hadn't moved in 2 years. When he called me to look at his irises, I thought he meant the flowers. He slid the lid off a box of glass eyes, asked me to choose a pair. A month later, he was run over on Helmley Hill, his eyes wide, a pillow of bloodied fur beside his head. And my final poem is titled What Can Happen If You Never Move House. All of this lot's yours, gestures the plumber, disjointing the downpipe on the porch roof in one sharp click. I'm rubbing my elbow at the thought of the twist when he misses hitting me with a rope of wet hair that turns out to be my grandmother's auburn curls entwined in my mother's pale mane. Years of washing their locks for the village hops. Just as I'm taking this in, that they've been hiding in the pipes since 1953, and thinking, would they come too if you slapped their cheeks? Another pile of slime lands at my feet, like a dead mermaid face down in the street. And I realise it's me who's scalped and inert. Half of us is always caught in a knot of pipework beneath boards. 20 quid, love, any time.
Thank you. Just a scholarly footnote on the daffodils, which were picked yesterday morning in our house in the Radley Hills. So they're genuine Welsh daffodils. They opened up on the train. Finally, Michelle Roberts, also an ex-rec poet, as well as many other distinctions. We also wrote a wonderful little book we have there, a short book called Silly Lady Novelists, ? Which is an allusion to an essay many of you all know by George Eliot. But far from being a silly lady novelist herself, she is an extremely distinguished one. Michelle, suck it to us.
First of all, I'd really like to thank Sue and Nick Murray of Rat Press, because they've made this evening possible and they've published us, and I'm sure I'm speaking for all of us in reiterating our thanks. And of course I want to thank these three marvellous poets. It's such a joy to read with you. And of course to thank all of you for being here. What a celebration. I'm going to read 2 poems from my sequence. It's called The Struggle Continues! ! And that's a slogan that any of you who lived through the 70s will remember. It's an old left-wing slogan. We probably need it more than ever. But we feministas in the 1970s, living in our collective houses, used it quite ironically, because we were often struggling with the men we loved, who lived with us, about things like cleaning lavatories and, you know, fishing hair out of plug holes. And we'd say it to them very, very lovingly, but we called it struggling, loving struggling. We meant women. I don't mean that we didn't also include men in our socialist struggles. So unapologetically, the struggle continues. And I'll read you the first and last poem. They're dedicated to my friend Stephen, who died 2 years ago. 1, a grammar of streets. Writing to you's like taking an unmapped walk, zigzag through Whitechapel, Stepney, Bethnal Green, Victoria Park and Mile End. We invent a rhythm of pause and pace, skip over the cracks of crazy pavement prophets, women on pedestals, women as diamonds, stroll past hallucinatory signs and stenciled posters, magic graffiti spells spray painted above market stalls. Brick wall stands fast as a 1930s page of type, locked to its frame, ready to print, sturdy as citizens who march against the fascists. Bright weeds dart from pockets of grit, like jokes into silences. We can buy bagels, bangles, fresh coriander, jellied eels, chips. The mosque and synagogue rub shoulders. Close by, a 15th century church, an almshouse, a field of Spanish Jewish bones. Taking this walk with you's a conversation. Shuttle of words plies back and forth from Spitalfields to supper in Strahan Road. We twist our threads of history together, not in our looping, different, heretic selves. And the last one, written after Stephen Hayward died, he ran the small press called Serif. As a lifelong lefty, he published lots of wonderful, very good left-wing prose of various kinds and novels, but also a range of really fantastic cookery books, Caribbean cookery books, North African cookery books, Jewish Moroccan cookery books. He was a great lover of life. So this poem is called Lighthouse at Finisterre. She watches from the fisted edges blue punch of nothingness. Stone index finger, the cliff lifts up, angel claiming your attention. Here, where your breath stops and you fall out of yourself, she announces a new pulse of the star's percussion. Her steady, unsteady strobe stammers, a Morse code for sailors, not lost. She's bright-eyed. She is night's core of light. Fishermen blink and unblink at her moonshine semaphore, her swivelling, net silvering gaze. Her erratic beam tracks the staccato beat of your heart, pilgrim, dancing your coracle over dream-dark seas. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for all poets. You can see what a pleasure it is to publish poetry of that order, and long may we continue to do so. Two announcements now. You have two tasks to complete before you're allowed to leave. One is you must have another drink. We're not taking those bottles back. Secondly, please buy some pamphlets.